All right, so officially, good morning, everyone. And thank you again for joining Corporate College's webinar series, Live with the Experts. We really appreciate you joining us for and allowing us really to provide you such relevant information and all these different thoughts, concepts, tools, action items that you can put into place today that are going to support you and really set you up for success. Each of us is still adjusting to this new norm, and Tri-C is no different. Tri-C, we remain committed to serving you at this time of change and uncertainty by providing actionable resources to help you, to help your team succeed and thrive wherever your team is located, either at the work site or working remotely. Our webinar series is just one of Corporate College's newest resources to prepare the workforce to overcome challenges and achieve both personal as well as business goals. And we do that by focusing on 4 different themes, with Kathy's session today related to virtual leadership. We have other sessions that focus on working remotely effectively, navigating a transition, and even personal health and well-being. And many of you already know that Corporate College has a just amazing talent bench of facilitators and subject matter experts. And today I'm really thrilled to welcome our facilitation specialist and presenter today, Kathy Talbin. Of course, Kathy is also a personal friend of mine, having worked here at the college. Kathy is fantastic at using strategic inquiry, thinking, and planning to really help individuals and organizations, even communities, think of new ways to plan their way into new futures. She helps improve their outcomes where everyone matters, and using Solve It by involvement SM methodology is one of her key strategies. Kathy really has a passion for building a culture of inquiry by teaching and coaching others in question thinking and a learner mindset. She received her master in adult learning and development from Cleveland State University and has a bachelor's of science degree in business administration with a major in computer and information systems from The Ohio State University. Kathy's expertise also includes being a senior human resource professional, a certified performance technologist, and also the founder and chief outcome strategist of I Solve It, her organizational effectiveness consulting firm. And I couldn't be more thrilled to have her back and see her again. So thank you so much, Kathy, for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm great. Thanks, Jerry. And good morning to everybody. I really appreciate you getting up and being here this morning and giving us your time so we can really talk about using inquiry to actually lead and navigate change. I think we can all agree that we live in a VUCA world. You may have heard about it. It really stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and at times ambiguity. And I think we're living through that right now. Sometimes this could affect one part of an organization. What we're seeing and feeling right now, it's really affecting everything in the organization. It's making us rethink how we need to continue to work and accomplish the outcomes for the organization. Anytime there's a change, whether it's planned or it's brought on to us, we're already on our way to an outcome, and all of a sudden we're taken off track. And sometimes it's a new question that helps us get back on track or redirect us into a new direction that we really need to be, because we have to be able to adapt and think our way through an uncertain time and be able to guide the organization into the future. And the best way I always think is to think your way through anything, especially change, is the use of inquiry, whether it's of yourself or of others. I recently read an article, and it was about what Google had learned from its quest to build a perfect team. And what jumped out at me in this article was that it said there's a collective IQ, a collective intelligence that emerges within a group. It could be a team, could be a whole organization that's really distinct from any one individual person. And questions help the organization or a team focus on what's important, but collectively they learn and they share and they innovate and they co-create. And that's what I believe gets people really involved. So basically, inquiry and change by nature go together. According to Peter Drucker, who was renowned as a prolific writer and consultant on the subject of management. In fact, I realized that when he passed away in 2005, he was celebrated by Business Week as being the man who invented management. He's got a very interesting background. And so here's what he has to say. He says, our questions create movement and change. I also heard someone say, we move in the direction of our questions. I selected this picture of a helix because I think it is more indicative of change because it really shows the complexity of change. And although you may be going toward the same direction, you have to be able to adapt and shift because another change, more information can come into play, and you have to build on it, continuing build on it. In fact, there's a great book called Building the Bridge as You Walk on It by, I think it's Peter Quinn. He's a management professor out of the University of Michigan. And so we really have to continually adjust. And I believe our questions help us make those adjustments. And our own David Cooper writer, who's here at CASE, and many of you may know, he's the co-creator of Appreciative Inquiry. He says we live in the world that our questions create. So if we want to ask questions that can lead to a breakthrough moment or create the world that we'd like to live in, what we really need to have first is an environment that encourages question asking. So again, in this article that I mentioned earlier about Google, one of the things they also pointed out that had a strong impact on a group is psychological safety. Because, you know, when you're working in a group, you have to be able to think together, play with ideas, and feel safe. You have to be able to question everything. And psychological safety itself is actually defined as a sense of confidence that team will not embarrass or reject or punish anybody for speaking out. And questions are constantly, you know, a way that we speak out and challenge what we're trying to do. It's really a critical element that the leader is responsible for, because I had a boss that I love the way that she looked at leadership. She always said that leaders set the conditions by which people can do their best work. And the conditions that leaders set are, you know, as we know, the expectations of what you want to be able to do. And actually, they provide the model of even how that you will ask questions and how you're treated when you ask questions, whether it's appreciated or not. So let's see if you can assess your own current environment. So this is a gut assessment. So I want you to, I'm going to ask you 4 questions, and I want you think of the area you want to assess. It's one obviously you have direct influence over. And as I read each one, I want you to be able to just write a letter. And the letter is really about frequency. How often do you see this taking place in that area? You'll use an M if it's most of the time, an S if it's some of the time, and an R if it's rarely. So the first question, so I just again want you to be able to write, you're going to write 4 letters, 1 letter for the answer to each of these questions. So the first question is, questions are asked by the leader. So how often do you hear, and if you're the leader, how often do you ask questions yourself, right? Where it's a genuine question. You really expect an answer. It's not a rhetorical question, it's a real question. So is it most of the time, some of the time, or rarely. Okay, so M, S, or R. Now, the second question is that you're going to ask about the followers. So how often do you hear the questions are being asked by the people in the room? And it's usually not the same. That's actually more than one person that's asking the questions. But again, do you see it most of the time that people are comfortable asking questions, some of the time, or rarely? So that's your second letter. The third one I want you to think about: have you ever observed any negative reactions to questions, or questions that are more judgmental in tone? And so there's a negative aspect to the question itself. And again, go ahead. Do you see this most of the time, some of the time, or rarely? So we're going to move on to the last one. Now, this is a curiosity question for me, because again, referring back to the article on Google and building effective teams, they actually talked, and I've seen this play out, maybe you have too, that if you've got established norms in a group, it actually can raise the collective consciousness or the intelligence of the group, because norms actually codify sometimes in what we call axioms. So I'm curious to see if you ever hear question axioms used in your own area or organization. The one that I remember hearing all the time was, there's no question that's a dumb question, or something similar to that, to actually encourage people to ask questions. So again, have you ever heard question axioms? Most of the time, some of the time, or rarely? So you've got 4 letters. You should have 4 letters written down. And so what I'd like you to do is look at the third letter. And if the third letter, which is about negative reactions, is an M or an S, I want you to circle it. Because what you need to then pay attention to is, how am I going to influence that? Because if there are negative reactions, or the questions themselves are negatives, it's going to basically hinder people wanting to either ask other questions or even answer your questions. And then when you look at your answers to the other 3 questions, if you have an S or an R, sometimes or rarely, circle that. Because what that means is you need to increase it. You need to increase and make it safer for people, the leader and the followers, to ask questions. And you might want to consider using some question axioms. And I'm going to share some with you today as well. Because I think you really want to create a safe environment where people are not afraid to ask a question, because you may need to actually challenge assumptions that people even have about question asking itself. So let's take a look at assumptions. These are assumptions that I have heard, and you may have heard these, and you may have heard others as well. So one of the assumptions that I have observed is, some people see questions as a challenge to their personally, like they're being challenged, their competence or their position is being. And so you can sometimes see that in a negative reaction that they may have when somebody asks a question. But that's assumption they have. They don't see questions as good. Another time I've actually heard somebody say, hey, if you're a team player, you shouldn't be asking questions. You just need to get on board. So I don't know if you've ever heard anything like that. And another assumption that I have observed too is, some people think, well, if people ask questions, they're really resistant. They're really not on board with the change. So I'd like you to enter in the chat if you have heard any other types of assumptions about questions. And I'll come back to that in a second, because what I'd like to do is really talk about what I believe are facts about questions. So the first fact that I'll share with you about questions is, questions really provide feedback and information. That's how I see it, and that's how I'd like you to start to see it if you don't already. Because when somebody asks you a question, they're really giving you information, and you're able to really see if they're making any assumptions or you're making any assumptions about the information you're sharing. You may think that you've made some assumptions about what they already know, but that question kind of gives you insight that sure enough, you weren't very clear, and they're helping you make sure that you are giving them the information that they need. Another fact I think that's important about questions is that questions really signal that people really care about the outcome. They really care about it. Because I don't know about you, but if you don't care about something, you're not going to ask a question about it. In fact, you may not answer or say anything at all. And so you have no feedback about what they have absorbed or what they may even wonder about. Because, you're able to guide people who want to move forward easier than, people who want to stand still. We used to say it's easier to pull a string than push a string. So I'm curious to see if there are any additional assumptions. So here's one. Questions mean that the supervisor doesn't know their job and they are not informed. Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting way to look at it. And as we said, to have good a kind of collective intelligence, you don't know everything, and you really want to actually harness the intelligence of the group. And so you're looking for input. So that's interesting. So we have to just be aware of our assumptions because they can actually get in the way. The other thing is you have to be willing to ask a question. There's something called question reluctance. So let me go here. So the definition for question reluctance is it's actually an unwillingness, or they're just disinclined to ask a question. I remember once coming out of a meeting, which is why I got very curious about questions, and somebody asked me a question about the meeting. Well, I was in there with them, and I said, "Well, that's a great question. Why didn't you ask that?" And well, I don't feel comfortable asking questions, and I always found that very curious because you can have a natural reluctance to not do that. So I'd like to do a self-assessment. So this is where you're going to use the yes and the no that Jerry had pointed out. So the question I'm going to pose to you is, I will pose a question to anyone. So you want to hit the yes or the no. Would you pose a question to anyone? Now, you might be thinking, well, it depends on the situation and the person. Well, if it depends, then you have a little reluctance. So for the purpose of this question, just say no. So there you go. So go ahead and answer that. And let's see. Jerry, I might wonder if you might be able to let us know how people are answering
Yes.
that.
Well, we are responding fairly, I'd say about 75% with the yes, 25% no.
Oh, good.
So
Well,
that's a
that's
good
great.
response.
Yes, that
Oh, now the
is.
no's are the no's are upticking again now.
Oh, there you go.
As soon as I said that.
That's okay. See, it takes a while to think, when you ask a
Right.
question, it really takes a while to think about it before you're able to respond. So this gives us an indication of how you really have to let people think before you expect them to respond. So now where
Sure.
are we sitting, Jerry?
Now we're actually stronger on the yeses. We're back up to
Okay.
like a 75, 80%.
Well, good. Well, that's terrific. Then we've got a good group
Hmm.
who are already comfortable asking questions, because it is natural sometimes to not to be reluctant. And it does, it does depend on the time and the circumstances, right? Because we do have to use judgment when we ask questions. So let's kind of go forward here. I want to give you your first question axiom, a question thinking axiom. And the first time I heard this, I thought, oh my God, that's so true. Every question missed is a potential crisis waiting to happen because you have a blind side, right? Um, I don't know if you've ever been on a committee or a group and you made an assumption about that another group was taking care of it and they thought you were, I mean, I just had that happen the other day. I watched that happen. In fact, anytime you have an assumption, sometimes you've got some missing questions that haven't been asked. And so this is just another way to show just how important being willing to ask a question really is, because it helps make sure that you're not blindsided by something. So what is question thinking? So question thinking is actually a term. So I want to introduce this to you. Question thinking is actually a method of intentional thinking about questions that we're asking. It actually is a skill. It's a skill that can actually be developed, and it improves the quality of the results. And so if you look at this model, you can see that it's a process. And if you look at it, you've got questions that drive to a decision, that then make you take an action that actually gives you a result. In fact, the axiom there says great results begin with great questions. You might also notice there's a little R there above the result, and that really is for reflection, because anytime you have a process, especially around questions, you want to really reflect about the question itself. Did it actually give you what you were looking? Maybe the question was vaguer, you need to restate it. So it actually gives you a way to reflect so that you get better at question asking. And so I want to just also point out that because it's a process, there's also some things that are going on internally and then some things that are externally. We're used to seeing the external, right? The actions and the results. But the internal sometimes is really about the questions themselves. Questions start internally, even if you're going to speak them out loud, even for that split second when it came into your thoughts and you wanted to say it, it was internal. And so we just need to just be aware that this is happening. In fact, we're listening all the time with the questions that we have. We're filtering what people are saying to us by the questions and assumptions that we have. And as I said, questions really are internal, and it's happening all the time. And we're very unaware of that. And I'd like to prove this to you by doing another exercise. So what I'd like you to do is I would like you to think about this morning when you were getting ready for your day and you had to decide what you wanted to wear. What I'd like you to do, and put this in the chat, I want you to put in what you're going to, what you ask yourself and to figure out what you're going to wear. So go ahead and put them in. There you go. And put that in. And I mean, what I asked myself this morning was, where else am I going? Because I don't have time to change. So again, put in the chat what it is that you said to yourself to figure out what you were going to do. Okay. Should I wear what I wore yesterday or a new set of clothes? What's the temperature today? Is it supposed to be there? And from Carly, what's going to be? I think, do I have any meetings? Right. So you can see, and some of these probably weren't out loud, they were internal. But will I be in public? Will I have the camera on? What will I be doing? Again, so all of those things ran through your head and they were questions. What can I wear that I picked out later when I go out, right? So again, and it takes you a while. And sometimes we change what we're going to wear. And so what you really look at, those were the questions. Then you decided to put it on. That's the action you took. And what you have on is actually, there's a result of that process. And we do that all the time and we don't really realize it. Um, so let's, oops, here we go. So what I'd like to do is another exercise. What I'd like you to do, I'm going to read some questions. So I'd like you, if you're willing, to close your eyes while I read these questions. Because what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to pay attention to how they make you feel. And you're going to enter an adjective in the chat and how they make you feel. So again, close your eyes for a second and let me read these to you. What is wrong with them? Whose fault is it? Why do we keep having this issue? So again, open your eyes and put an adjective. How did that make you feel? How did those questions make you feel? Anxious, judged, belittled, upset, defensive, all negative, right? Which is why we call them judger questions, right? That's how we classify them. So I want to do this again. You're going to close your eyes. I'm going to actually give you 3 other questions. And it's close your eyes. How can we get better together? What are the facts? What do we really, there we go, sorry. What's the best thing we can do right now? So again, enter in the chat adjectives. Optimistic, empowered, positive, definitive, active, relief, right? So how you state a question has an impact on how it's going to land. And so it's really important that you ask a learner question, because that's what we refer to these as. They're learner questions. They're from a learner mindset. And so a learner mindset is a curious one. It's an open-minded mindset. The questions are really asked or intended because you're trying to resolve something. You're intending a positive outcome. Right? And you could tell by the tone of my voice what that question meant. And in fact, the mindset you ask a question from actually trumps the question itself, right? So that's what it says, mindset trumps question. And mindset is actually defined by Marilee Adams. And Marilee Adams is involved with the Inquiry Institute. That's where the QDAR model came from. And she says that a mindset represents a set of beliefs and assumptions that we hold about ourselves and the world, right? It's where we're coming from. So let's now look at some criteria for a learner question in itself. What we really want to look at is the question future focus, even if it's in the present. It's really looking at it from a learner or a future focused perspective. It's open-ended. We know that closed-ended questions, are just a limited number. It could be actually a yes or no. And as we said, it has to come from a learner mindset. It has to be delivered in a neutral or acceptable or curious tone so that people actually know that. So those are 3 critical criteria for a learner question. And I want to point out too, and I mentioned this a second ago about genuine questions. The only kind of question that's genuine is one to which the answer is unknown. I don't know if you've ever been in a place where the question was rhetorical. They never meant it to be answered, or it was a statement that's actually sounds like a question, but it really isn't. And we really want to ask intended questions where we really expect responses. There are also what I call breakthrough learner questions, and these are more strategic in nature than tactical in many cases, and they really look at, they identify sometimes the assumptions and they challenge them. They look at them from a different perspective. It actually can expand the possibilities by looking at it more deeply, change the direction of it. And so I'd like to offer you a story that kind of shows that. And this has to do with Pepsi or Coke. I read this long ago, and it stuck with me. There was a breakthrough question asked by a new president. I can't remember if it was Coke or Pepsi, but it was one of those. And you may be aware that these two companies are big competitors, their brands. And at the time, if you were to look at their marketing actions, the questions that they were actually operating from were, how do we take market share away from the other brand, right? They were competing with each other. The way they were doing the marketing was competing against each other. And the new president decided one day to say, but what do people drink? All of a sudden it opened other possibilities, and what they realized, and this was a while ago, people were actually paying for bottled water, and they realized that they really needed to start competing against water and milk. And so they actually expanded their marketing, and they got different results. And so although this question might seem simple, it challenged assumptions. It looked at the situation from a different perspective. And as I said, it expanded some possibilities. What I hope this story does is it just provides an example of how one question can really change the trajectory of what an organization might be doing next. So in addition to having a good learner question, I think there's also some guidelines I'd like to share about when you ask the question itself. And so here are 5 guidelines to consider when you are going to ask a question. You do need to determine the right time. If you don't have time to really talk about this, then don't ask a question when you have 5 minutes when the conversation might last for 30, right? So you do want to think of the right time to ask the question. You also want to make sure when you're going to ask the question that you've got their attention, because people drift off. And you could consider setting up the question so that they know you're asking a question. You can actually be explicit and say, I have a question about whatever. Or I'd like to hear what questions you have. So people really know your intent and it's very clear. And you need to pay attention. You need to look and observe to see how they are actually hearing that question and seeing if their body language is telling you that they're not sure what you're asking. Because sometimes their questions are too broad and we might have to paraphrase them, bring them down, bring them more narrow, and even give context about why you are wanting to have this question and conversation in the first place. And lastly, and this is the hardest one, and that is to wait, because we are so used to wanting to be quick about everything. You have to be prepared to wait for a response. And I say count to 10, give yourself a good minute, and stay there and wait for people to think. And again, prompt them, restate the question, whatever you need to do, so that people get used to the fact that when you ask a question, you really want them to think about it and you really want them to talk about it. And so you've asked the question, but now you need to be able to it. And I'm going to ask you to actually think of this phrase, to listen with learner ears. So we've had learner questions, and now we want to have learner ears to their responses, because we can easily filter and listen to what they say and discount it, as opposed to ourselves staying curious and even asking ourselves, well, what am I hearing that I haven't heard before? What does this make me notice that I haven't noticed before? What can I discover by what they're actually saying to me, and what might be valuable here? Because when you think of this question thinking axiom, it's so important, because quality listening is essential to the process of effective question answering. People know that you're listening to them when you then even paraphrase what they say, connect it to things you've already said, build on and appreciate the fact that they've brought a new perspective in to the conversation that's going to be valuable, and continue to build on it, because you're actually continuing to increase the collective intelligence of the group itself. So there are actually I'll introduce some question protocols here. So these are just an example of other kinds of protocols and when you can use questioning, and give you some ideas. So here we've got a questioning protocol, and as I said, when I first became aware that people were afraid to ask questions, I was curious, and that's how I learned more myself about question thinking. And I went to a workshop, like I think it was a decade ago already. And since I have an outcome focus, I have an epiphany. And so instead of, when I run meetings, and I offer this as something for you to think about, get clear at what you want the outcome of that meeting to be. What do you want to really walk away with? Is it the decision? Is it the plan? Specifically, what do you want to walk away from? And then in your own preparation, think of the line of inquiry that's really needed to drive the outcome. Okay, so think about that. And you can actually, instead of having topics you're going to cover in the meeting, is a line of inquiry that's going to help you have conversation to get to your outcomes. And we know, and at least I know, I never are going to have all the questions, but I'm going to start with some questions that will get people started. And I always ask, what else should we be asking? And I actually put that on the agenda, and that way people know that you are inviting them to ask other questions to get to those outcomes. And I challenge you to try and do this so that you can actually see how that meeting feels and operates much differently. So that's one thing to consider, is using questions in your meetings. Other is, and I'll just briefly say what they are. One is a Q prep, and that really is to, even as I had said with the meeting, you want to think about the questions that you want to ask. So this could be a one-on-one, and you could, this is actually a structured series of questions that you can ask yourself all the time as you are actually preparing. So, what are your goals? What questions are you asking of yourself and the other person? What questions do you think they may want to ask you? So you're really reflecting and preparing for that interaction in a very planful kind of way. And you want to be able to get prepared for what that might help you get prepared to do. And so again, it's just a way that you can use questions to get yourself ready for something. And the final one I'm just going to share, and this is the one I love and use a lot, actually. And instead of using brainstorming, this is similar to brainstorming, it's Q storming. So just as in brainstorming, you're trying to generate a lot of possibilities and not judge them. That's what you do with Q storming. But you're really at the front end of the process, remember. You're not trying to jump to the end. You're actually trying to think about the situation itself. There's 3 phases to Q storming. You want to set the foundation and ask, what's the situation and exactly what are the goals? What are the goals, the outcomes that you are really focusing on? And this is also very, very critical. And that is, what are the assumptions and the facts that you're making about this goal? Because if you can uncover the assumptions, it allows you to ask more questions about it, right? Because we don't want to have missed questions. And so you spend a good part of time really getting that down so everybody understands the scope of what you're trying to do. And then you go into a generation phase of question asking. And all you're doing is generating questions and not judging them. And they build on each other and feed on each other. And what's really, really important is that the more people you have generating questions from different perspectives, the better you'll be able to see whatever it is you're focusing on. And after you've generated all these questions, you have to go away and analyze these and categorize these and then be able to come back maybe to that group, or maybe it's a different group. It depends what you're trying to accomplish. And then select the questions that you're going to really spend the time talking about, and then using those to create action plans and to go from there. So those are just some of the extra kinds of protocols that can be used by using questions now instead of jumping right to answers. So I know we have some time here, and I wanted to make sure we had time to be able to see what questions you now have about what you've heard so far, whether it's about learner questions or the environment or any of the protocols. So if you could go ahead and put any questions that you have into the chat.
Hey, Kathy. So there was
Yes.
one question earlier
Yes.
that I wanted to make sure that I'm
Sure.
not sure if it was responded to or you had a chance to see it, but it was back when you were asking about these questions when it starts off a meeting, because we had so many people. It was like a bell curve, with many of the people on the seldom, and often, and then rarely. So they said, that they have a couple of sensitive team members, one with, maybe feeling that their feelings might be heard. And so they're more, hesitant about asking some questions. So like, what could you recommend in those situations?
Well, thanks for the question. Thanks for calling that out, Jerry, because things were flying by real fast.
Right.
So, you have to be sensitive, right? You're trying to get people to understand that you want to see questions as a positive thing, and they may have a history of not feeling safe, or having some assumptions about questions, and so I'd recommend just have a one-on-one with someone. If you notice that someone bristled when you ask a question, and it wasn't intended to the way that they took it, to be able to have a one-on-one with them and let them know, or even there, I'm just really curious. And in fact, that's something to consider. What I've tried to do, because I'm sensitive around that, I will preface before I even ask a question, say, I'm really curious about something. Can I ask a question? And that way people go, oh, okay, it's coming from a curious place. So that's one way to kind of set it up. Was there anything else that I missed, Jerry, that we should, well, anybody else's? I've got
Um,
people coming and asking questions.
Yeah, so you've got a couple questions coming in. I would say the only other one, not that you missed, but they were kind of scrolling through pretty quickly, was kind of both. There's two questions around the same thing about, you know, how do you phrase the questions so that it doesn't reflect or give people the perception that you're either not paying attention or that you don't have like subject matter expertise, that you don't know your job or that you're not informed?
Mm. Um, well, one way to do that is to put some context around it, so people know where you might be coming from. So it could say, well, I'm curious about this. I've been in a similar situation and I'm wondering how this might be similar. So here's my
Mm-hmm.
question about that. And so that can kind of, again, you're trying to kind of set it up so you're trying to make sure people know your intent, right? Because it's easy for people to go into feeling like the intent is a negative one when it's really a positive.
Yeah, that was great. And that was great, the examples that you gave us when you posed those questions and had us reflect with the adjectives. So you have another attendee here who was, I've never heard of this, so probably you have, Kathy, but they're very proactive. They've been using a process called co-discover questions at the
Okay.
beginning of their meetings.
Oh, cool. Cool. I don't know if it's similar to learner questions. It could be the line of discovery questions. It'd be interesting to know if they have a standard set that they use or they're building a set. But I think that's really great because first off, it's a norm. That's what I hear. It's a norm. They're doing it all the time. So people are used to doing it. And what's great about that is that when people are used to doing it, they look forward to that. They understand the intent of it, and it naturally gets them more curious to ask more questions. So I think that's a great thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with a group of IT professionals, and they and they're always under pressure, hitting deadlines.
Right.
Yeah, crazy. It's a crazy environment. But again, they started using queue storming as part of a standard process for their specs, and they found it really invigorating and went back and discovered more about what they really didn't understand from the client when they did it. And it became a norm, right? And
Mm.
so people got excited about doing it because it was a way for them to expand their thinking instead of narrow and making assumptions. In fact, we're not even aware of our assumptions sometimes, and making them explicit allows us to see them. So even having
Oh.
that is a standard question, what are our assumptions, and really getting them all out as a norm, and then ask questions about those and challenge those assumptions and think of things. So that's great. Let me see
That
what
is
other.
great.
Yeah, it really is. Making assumptions visible is really, really important.
Oh, and I've been so bad assuming at those assumptions.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's what we say, what assume means, right?
Right, I know.
So you want to make them explicit.
Yeah.
Let me think. Let me see,
So
what
we
else
just
do we
just
have?
had the gal responded just saying that this allows each person to be prepared to answer a question that may or may not be related to the meeting, but that it's okay to say, for example, what are you looking forward to in achieving this week and how are you feeling? So that was a
Hmm.
little bit more definition about the code discover questions.
Okay,
So,
that's great.
and then you had another gal who was asking if you could talk just a little bit more about collective intelligence.
Okay, so collective intelligence is um, you're in a place where the group is learning from each other. I might know a lot on my expertise, right? And that's all I can bring to the table. But if you're there and you came from a different perspective, you could ask different kinds of question, or you have knowledge I just don't have. And by working together and challenging each other, we start to learn from each other. So we collectively have a higher IQ together than only one individual. Sometimes we've been in groups and there's always the person who knows the most about that. And so we defer to them, right?
Right.
But it's very common that you could have from a different perspective or different life. Here's the other thing that I see all the time. People only know you in the role you're currently serving, and they don't ever know a lot of times that you might have reinvented yourself and you were in architecture before, maybe you were in IT before, now you're in HR. So you have that, but people don't know that. But that gives you a certain insight and a different perspective that you can offer to the group and have them see something more holistically than making assumptions that, oh, well, this is just like that. Well, maybe it's not. Maybe it's not like that.
Right. Right.
Um,
Different perspective. Yeah.
Different perspective. And so you learn better together than when you're sharing. And again, that comes down to psychological safety. You have to feel comfortable to be able to be in an environment where you're doing that, you know?
Right. Right.
People get excited. I don't know. I'm sure some of you have been in those environments where you're like, I love working with these people. They
Yes.
challenge me. I learned so much from them. And then we've probably been in those others where you're like, oh, I can't wait to get off this team. They are just so negative. It's such a downer.
Right. Yep.
So anyhow, let me see. Are there any other questions? I'm only
Well,
seeing a few here.
there's a few more. This one, Kathy, you may have already answered, but Deborah was asking about in the Q protocols. She really liked the idea that we try to figure out the assumptions. So we talked a little bit, you talked at length about that, but
Mhm.
thinking back, she said, oftentimes they were unrecognized or unconscious assumptions that have
All the
caused
time.
roadblocks and breakdowns. Yeah. Do you have any other ideas about how to kind of really dig in and identify assumptions with your team?
Well, you've got to stick with it. Okay. So it's just like, that's a question. It's a loaded question. What assumptions are we making? Sometimes people are nervous about putting it on the table. They're thinking, well, I think this is an assumption. Maybe they don't think it is. So again, you have to have a kind of a safe environment. But, I may have, when I'm working with a group, I may already have some assumptions myself, and I want to offer them if there's a lull and say, are we assuming this or that? And people go, yeah, I think we are. And the
Hmm.
more you start generating it, you get a couple started, people start then really thinking, I think we are making this assumption. And they are so invisible, but you know what? People make decisions based on assumptions and they don't even know it. And that's the scarier part, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. I
So,
mean, in just any conversations within, I'm thinking not just internally within the organization, but when now you start talking to vendors, suppliers, other people externally too, the assumptions they may have too.
right, right. Here's a question I always ask when I'm dealing in a situation I've never been in. And it could be as a customer. I do this a lot as a customer when I'm calling to get help from customer support or
Hmm.
whatever. I only ask what I know about, but there's so many things I don't know and I make assumptions
Mm,
about. So I always ask, is there anything else you think I should know
that's
about
great.
this? And they will be things that they would not have offered up, but because I gave them the opening, they said, well, this is where most people make mistakes, so remember to do X, Y, and Z. And I get these pearls of wisdom that I never would have gotten. So I always ask the question. I assume they may know more than I, and they would be
Hmm.
willing to share if only I asked.
No, that's so true. That is so true. And even you hear customer service people now too, even asking, is there anything else before they hang up? Is there anything else
Anything else,
that I can help you with? So it's kind of the same thing, just in reverse. You're asking them for it. Hey, is there something I didn't think to ask?
That's right. And they go, oh, well, and it takes them a couple minutes, but I'm telling you, they every single time they actually come up with something I never would have thought. In fact, I've actually gotten some deals sometimes.
Wow,
Yeah,
very
because
nice.
because I didn't know. So, hey, all I had to do was ask a question, right? So,
Right,
yeah.
right.
Okay.
Wow, I
So
think we got to all the questions so far. Is any, well, I'll stay
good.
on another minute to see if there's any other questions. But while we're waiting for those questions, I just wanted to, say how true. I just like I'm so lucky and blessed to be on these webinars and learn these different things along with our attendees. This has really been an incredible and an eye opener on so many different levels. I mean, I always understood about creating the right environment, and that obviously allows for engagement, but just what you've dove into deeper about asking the right questions, Kathy, that was really eye-opening and really effective, especially if you obviously want to achieve the outcomes you desire. That is excellent.
Yes. I
So,
see hierarchical silence an issue for most people. I'm not sure what that might mean. I can make some assumptions about what that might mean. Um, uh, and I don't know if that has to do with people are afraid to ask questions of higher ups or vice versa. But again, you know, it's really trying to set the conditions for people to ask questions. So I want to close. I have a couple things real quick to close here.
mhm.
And I love this quote from Albert Einstein. In fact, he celebrated his 100th birthday last year. Case did this great
Yeah.
thing about it. Yeah. So here's what he said. If I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on the solution, that's pretty high stakes. I would spend the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask. For once I know the proper question, I can solve the problem in less than 5 minutes.
Wow.
Think about that. Yeah, that's pretty wild. And sometimes having the right people in the room looking at it from different perspectives allow you to figure out what the right questions to ask are. Challenge to you for the next 30 days. So until July 24th, this is what I challenge you to do. Two are observations. So you want to really listen and watch for questions. And I mean everywhere. In fact, I bet you're going to be paying attention to questions that you hadn't blew by you before. So whether you're reading, observing, or talking, I love to watch interviews because I watch what the questions they ask. And you want to say, well, how are they involving you or the other person? How do they make you feel? Even leading questions are pretty not good. They're awful questions. Open-ended questions allow people to go anywhere, right?
Hmm.
The other one is meetings. When you're in meetings, I want you to just pay attention. Anybody asking questions? Who is the leader asking the questions or people asking the questions? What kind of questions are people asking? Just pay attention now. And then third, do something, practice. So practice planning some questions, either before an interaction or a meeting. So
Excellent.
anyhow, in summary, we've got probably 30 seconds here. You've assessed your question reluctance. You've assessed your environment to some degree. Um, uh, and you know what question thinking is now. You've got a process, QDARL. QDAR. Um, you have some question thinking axioms you can use, and you have 30 days challenge to do some observation and practicing. My hope is that you're going to lead with learner questions from a learner mindset as you navigate change together. So feel free to contact me if you have any other questions. And Jerry,
It's so funny, Natalie. So Natalie gets the gold star today, Kathy, because
what,
her
what,
last
what?
question was, yes, I have. Is there anything else I may need to know that I don't know?
um,
And it's
uh,
100% effective each
it's
time.
each time it is. It is. Is there anything else you need to know? Um, I think, you know, that it's a practice. Okay. So there are sometimes, and you can't be hard on yourself. You have to have the resilience to keep asking questions. You don't want to be shut down, or you want to be more reflective too, to learn how to get better at questions. But you have to just appreciate that depending on the organization and the people you're with, it may shift. You may be with one group and they're all in, and others or need, more work to get to a place where people feel comfortable asking questions of each other, because it's really about understanding the intent of where you're coming from. So that's why it's important to ask them from a learner mindset and a learner kind of question, because the others don't produce any value.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So
Absolutely. Well, with
anyhow,
that, Kathy, I just wanted to say, on behalf of everyone here at Corporate College, again, thank you so much. Thank you for being a part of our team. Thank you for hosting this webinar session this morning. It's been amazing. To let everybody know as we're wrapping up here that Kathy has been brought to us this morning by our Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses program. The Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses is a partnership with Tri-C and is a classroom-based practical business education program that gives small business owners really several benefits, including valuable skills for growing their businesses, opportunities to access financial capital, and really attend some powerful networking opportunities. And it's all at no cost. Amazing, right? So what a fantastic program. I know they're booked up for this fall semester, but they will have another cohort going through in the spring. So if you're interested, please go ahead and visit our Tri-C website at tri-c.edu/10KSB. And there'll be more information to register for that, or you can contact Heidi Selzner at 216-987-3162. I'm also going to post that in the chat real quick. But in the meantime, again, thank you everyone for joining. Corporate College is really about providing these relevant tools to you on a constant basis. And we're so fortunate to really just have a great program, great audience, and great content and subject matter experts like Kathy. So feel free to rewatch Kathy's seminar today. That it will be on our free webinar series page at Corporate College. Within the next couple of days. So possibly tomorrow, but more than likely by Friday. So please visit the webpage, and you can always stay up to date with us by following us also on social media. So again, everyone, thank you so much. Please stay safe, healthy, and ready to take on the next challenges. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
have a great day.